This all feels a little intimate, doesn't it? Brand new camera. We're in 1080p now. I mean, what else could you want? Welcome to the Godward Podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and this is the second episode on Dante. The first one went viral, took over the internet. So this one we're basically just going to focus on the seventh circle of hell as an attempt to rouse some rabble, something like that, just to poke the bear a little bit. In my last episode, I promised to look a little closer at the lowest rung of the seventh layer of hell, where both quote-unquote sodomites and usurers are punished, according to Dante Alighieri, famous Italian poet who believed, in keeping with Roman Catholic teaching, that homosexuality and lending money at interest were bad. Now, your average half-literate American idiot alive in 2020 believes himself to be smarter than everyone who ever lived before 1950 and would dismiss Dante's thinking as medieval, as if that's an obvious insult. Well, one of the things I try to do on this podcast is humble myself before the past and not assume myself to be better than the great writers and thinkers simply because I can thumb through Twitter. When you do that, when you really relinquish the idea that history moves linearly toward a progressive utopian future, you can set aside the impulse to reject the past as less morally enlightened and try to understand it in its own terms. You might even learn something if you consider the possibility that in some ways people living 700 years ago might have had certain ways of thinking that are even more sophisticated than our own way of thinking, where basically one narrative exists telling us that everything is equal, and if you try to argue against that, you run up against the, well, that's just your opinion, man, thing. Am I being too grim here? By the way, I'm also using new audio. So if it's a little echoey, I don't know, we'll see. Basically, if I have to, I'll order another USB thing and use the old microphone with this, but thought I would give it a try. But okay, you might ask, why sort of zero in on the most controversial part of Inferno? Why not focus on the circle of hell where gluttony is punished or where murder is punished? That way you wouldn't risk offending a right-minded progressive liberal. Well, the answer is that I actually want to turn up the dials on the contrast here. I want to show you as much as possible just how different the world looked. How different were their concerns, and how, at the very least, their own worldview was at least as internally coherent and consistent as our own. We're going to look at sodomy and usury precisely because they have almost reached the point of being completely accepted in mainstream society in 2020. And I think it's important to know, especially for Christians, that this widespread, morally indifferent and apathetic situation, even within what remains of Christendom, would have shocked and scandalized a medieval Christian. So to review, let's go first, like I did last time, just to review the last episode, through the levels of hell from, least bad at the top down to worse. Okay, so the beginning was limbo, where we saw the virtuous pagans and Socrates and so on. And then lust. Lust being the least bad of the sins in some sense because it's what do you call that? It's a sin of continence, right? As is gluttony beneath that, greed beneath that. Although by the time you get to greed, it starts to be a little bit more than just a sin of incontinence, right? It's like it starts to get perverse. Like, what are you doing with all the, you picture, what's his name, McDuck, the Scrooge McDuck or whatever, swimming in the coins. Like, that's a little more than just overdoing it. Then there's wrath in the fifth circle, and then in the sixth circle you pass over the river of Dis into the deep pit of hell because the sixth circle is heresy. Okay? Heresy is pretty bad, right? Like, that's denying God and so on. But worse than that is violence, the seventh circle. So the seventh circle of hell punishes the sin of violence And that's where we're going to hang out for most of this episode. But there are a lot of subdivisions in the violence category, and so we'll trace a few of the interesting layers that exist within the seventh circle. Among them, murder, suicide, sodomy, and usury. Before we get to sodomy and usury, recall that Dante's hell is organized as a deep pit, like I said, that descends to the lowest rung of hell, where Satan himself remains. The lower you go in that direction, the worse the sin is. Understanding that, take a guess at which sin is lower and closer to the bottom of hell, because it is deemed worse, murder or suicide. For Dante, the circle punishing violence is divided into 3 levels. The least bad, violence against neighbors, includes murderers and war makers. So maybe like Jeffrey Dahmer and Donald Rumsfeld, right? One level worse than that is violence against the self, which includes the suicides and those who destroy their own substance. So there is something of a surprise here for most modern people. If you ask most people alive in the world today which is worse, murder or suicide, even just in terms of criminal justice theory, that is, so even if you try to avoid the word sin, you'll find that an overwhelming majority thinks murder is worse, and typically much worse than suicide. Why is that? I think it's because our own theory of justice relies now almost entirely on the Enlightenment principles of consent and property, where the body is considered property. This contrasts with a Christian metaphysical view, or a traditional Christian metaphysical view, in which sin is bad, not in relation to consent, but in relation to God chiefly, where the greater and more grotesque and willful the betrayal, the worse the sin. Side note here, sometimes students would tell me that sin is sin. Always Protestants, sin is sin, and that all this parsing is speculative and probably confusing. But remember, the church sort of reigned over the civic order in the 14th century. So this is really also a question of civil justice. Like, would you want a criminal justice system that doesn't distinguish between various sorts of crimes, some being worse and some being better? I mean, think of, like, in the Catholic tradition, you've got the venial and the mortal sins and so on. I mean, I can understand why it seems it's like a little too technical or something, but I don't know, we do this in the criminal justice, right? Like, we do treat murder and, interestingly, like rape, for example, right? Because rape is one of these things that violates the consent principle, whereas it's, so it's punished extremely badly, like murder. Whereas, I'm trying to think of, gluttony isn't punished at all, right? Even though, according to Dante, that's a sin, but, if you consent to eat the whole bag of chips, then the moderns just say, what's the problem here, right? So anyway, let me see where. Murder is bad, right? As bad as murder is, though, Dante sees suicide as worse, because it is a more fundamental betrayal of the gift of existence given by God to man. But just think how different this is from our contemporary world, like I said, as represented by popular media. In fact, if ever I see some, thing on Twitter about some celebrity suicide, we're generally, celebrating them for the next week. We're told how fine a person they were, and, they're almost venerated as tragic heroes. This certainly would not have happened in 14th century Florence, at least if Dante had his way. This is a scandal. It's a crime against God. But there are 3 layers in the 7th circle of hell. As I said, the least bad is murder, and worse than that is suicide, and worse than that, are you ready, is lending money at interest and sodomy. According to Dante, this 3rd level of the 7th circle of hell is still violence. Murder was violence against neighbors. And suicide was violence against the self. But lending money and doing sodomy, these are violence against God, art, and nature. According to 14th century Florentine Roman Catholic poet Dante, you understand. I'm just summarizing. By contrast, remember the heterosexuals who commit the sin of lust are way up in the second circle of hell. So, this used to perplex students, for real. Like, why this huge gulf between the forbidden illicit sex between an unmarried man and a woman up in the second circle, and the unmarried sex between two same-sex people? To answer that, I'm going to quote an article by Ann Gardner, English professor at John Jay College at City University, New York. She says, quote, "Why this big separation?" The answer is extremely important and revealing. Dante wants us to understand that homosexuals do not suffer in life from a deficiency of the will, as lustful heterosexuals do, in failing to control their natural urges. Rather, they engage in a willful defiance of nature. Indeed, Dante presents them as violent against nature. End quote. Do you follow? Heterosexual lust is a sin of continence. Basically, you kind of know you're not supposed to do it, but you can't help it. Comparable to eating the whole bag of Skittles. It's a sin, and it's something we should be ashamed of. But it's actually part of how you were programmed. We love sugar and we love sex, so that we, remember to eat and have children. But some, here's my joke again. But according to 14th century Florentine poet Dante, who was Roman Catholic and who had some eccentric ideas that most people today don't agree with, homosexual sex is not the same as this. Instead, it is a kind of violence against nature, which is revealed by the fact that it does not lead to reproduction, and therefore it must be a kind of dark impulse, basically a behavior intended to anger God. This represents a fundamentally divergent understanding between the medieval conception and the modern conception of what is going on when quote-unquote sodomy occurs. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Dante probably would have classified as sodomy oral and anal variations, even among heterosexual people, for the same reason. They don't lead to babies. Dante is very delicate in his handling of this subject matter, by which I mean you have to really understand what he's saying to even catch that he's indicating the sodomites. It's as if he believes this sin to be too grievous to discuss openly. But now for the big question, how is sodomy like usury? What analogy, what simile can tie these two very different behaviors together and demonstrate that they deserve the same sort of punishment? Keep in mind, it's probable that a majority of Americans have never even heard the word usury. Usury is so accepted, so taken for granted, so pervasive, that most people don't even understand it as a category, and certainly have no idea that it's still a serious sin according to Catholic teaching, just as it was in 1320. So first, let's define it. Usury is lending money at interest. Period. No, not at an unreasonably high interest rate. That's a false definition that you might have caught a glimpse of in a high school economics class. No. In Christian terminology, usury is defined and prohibited as lending money at interest. We will see that it is understood this way by Dante, and it is to be punished for the same reason that sodomy is. Namely, it is a sin against nature and against the Creator by extension. How so? First, let's look at Dante's lines in the poem, and then I'll give you a bit more background on why this line of thought is so prevalent. And then we can think about why it is nearly forgotten. Remember, this sin is deemed worse than murder by Dante. Let's be a little more specific about this, though, first. It's not merely a sin against nature. It's, even more specifically, a sin against what he calls art. And art is a practical discipline, like a skill or a craft. Listen to this definition of it I found on the YouTubes.
Note that Dante does not mean art in the particular sense of drawing, painting, sculpture, etc., although these pursuits would fall under the category. Instead, he is applying the term art in a much more general sense to mean any endeavor by which man harnesses nature, that is, the world as it exists in itself, apart from his influence, to work for his benefit. In this sense, art refers to the various practical disciplines, such as craftsmanship, industry, and technology, by which man takes the raw materials of nature and uses them to make artifacts that give him a livelihood.
Okay, so that's an art, right? You're building something, you're doing something, you're making something out of raw materials. The main discussion of the sin of usury occurs in Canto 11, just as they're approaching the seventh circle, and Dante's guide Virgil does the explaining. After Dante puts in a request, he says, Dante says, "Go back a little further to where you spoke of usury as an offense against God's goodness. How is that made clear?" And Virgil answers, quote, "Philosophy makes plain by many reasons to those who heed her teachings how all of nature, her laws, her fruits, her seasons, spring from the ultimate intellect and its art." I'm going to continue there because Virgil goes on, but so what you've got here is the beginning of a description of natural law theory, which was developed, or sort of came to fruition, I guess, by Thomas Aquinas, not even a full generation before Dante. In other words, natural law theory was like the cutting-edge theory of Dante's day, okay? Listen to the audio clip defining it here, and then we'll talk more about it.
So these are the basic goods, and from them we can derive the natural laws. We don't need the Bible or religion class or church in order to understand the natural law, Aquinas said. Instead, our instinct shows us the basic goods, and reason allows us to derive the natural law from them. Right acts, therefore, are simply those that are in accordance with the natural law. So, how does this whole system work? Well, I recognize the basic good of life because I value my own life, and that's clear to me because I have a survival instinct that keeps me from doing dangerous, stupid stuff. Then, reason leads me to see that others also have valuable lives, and from there I see that killing is a violation of natural law.
And it's not just murder, it's like you can derive the natural law from observing nature. That's the idea. Now, all this goes back to Aristotle, of course. So Virgil continues to explain to Dante. He says, "And if you read your physics with due care," that's Aristotle's physics, "you will note not many pages from the start that art strives after her by imitation, as the disciple imitates the master. Art, as it were, is the grandchild of creation." Now again, art here is, a skill, essentially. You're making something, right? So art is the grandchild of creation. Virgil continues, "By this, recalling the Old Testament near the beginning of Genesis, you will see that in the will of providence, man was meant to labor and to prosper. But usurers, by seeking their increase in other ways, scorn nature in herself and her followers." End quote. And there, Virgil pretty much puts an end to the topic. When later in Canto 17 or 18, Virgil and Dante pass through this lair of hell where the usurers actually are, Virgil stays behind as Dante goes to speak very briefly to the gang of usurers who are crouching close to the brim of the eighth circle, which, by the way, the eighth circle is the circle for the fraudulent. And so they're like right on the cusp of being even at a lower layer, right? And as Dante approaches them, he reports, quote, "Their eyes burst with their glimpse, their smoking hands jerked about their bodies, warding off now the flames and now the burning sands. And then he continues, dogs in summer bit by fleas and gadflies, jerking their snouts about, twitching their paws, now here, now there, behave no otherwise. So this seems to be the main part of their punishment, just the constant forever lack of comfort. But they're also depicted as having an enormous purse hung around their necks, each marked by its respective coat of arms, indicating the various usurious families of Florence. Basically, Dante endorses natural law here. So again, what is natural law? Well, I mean, as I understand it, it is the claim that certain moral truths are literally true and anchored in reality, in nature, especially human nature. It's a slippery term, but if anyone articulated a natural law viewpoint, it was Thomas Aquinas. This is a really complicated and ornate school of thought, one I'm not an expert in at all. The Summa Theologica was completed in 1274, when Dante was like 9 years old. So as I said, this is the cutting-edge theory of the day. And yet, it's anchored way back in Aristotle, in the ancient tradition. In fact, it seems to have roots even in the pre-Socratics, to the extent that they were seeking the principle that governs the universe and human beings. Here's a chunk from the Wikipedia page on natural law that quotes Aristotle. So this is Aristotle, and he's going to quote Sophocles here. So, quote, "Universal law is the law of nature, for there really is, as everyone to some extent divines, a natural justice and injustice that is binding on all men, even on those who have no association or covenant with each other. It is this that Sophocles' Antigone clearly means when she says that the burial of Polynices was a just act in spite of the prohibition. She means that it was just by nature. Quote, not of today or yesterday it is, but lives eternal. None can date its birth." Pausing on my Aristotle quoting there. In the story of Antigone, the king rules that Polynices shouldn't be buried for some reason. I don't remember. He like betrayed the state somehow. And so the ruling is leave his body out exposed to just be eaten by the wolves. And Antigone finds that, so that's the law, right? But Antigone finds that to be atrocious because she's in touch with higher law. Like she goes, I don't care what the law of the land is. Every man deserves a burial by nature, okay? So that's her appeal there. And that's what Aristotle sees as the even more ancient like origins of natural law. And you notice there that it's like universal, right? In place and time, I suppose. Continuing to quote Aristotle a little more here, he says, "And so Empedocles, when he bids us kill no living creature, he is saying that to do this is not just for some people, while unjust for others. Quote, nay, but an all-embracing law, through the realms of the sky, unbroken it stretcheth, and over the earth's immensity." Okay, end quoting from Aristotle there. So these laws of nature are given by God, if you like, or merely by the fact that they exist and they are found everywhere the same. The manner of conception, for example, is the same in all places and all times, and it is not culturally determined. Thus, in Dante's mind, the teaching against non-procreative sex can also be assumed to be universally valid, not determined by what the Supreme Court of the United States rules in 2012, for instance. So in light of natural law theory, it's odd to me that so many Americans changed their minds about same-sex marriage between 1990, which is when the question was first polled reliably, and 2020, where we are now. This huge shift in opinion indicates either everybody was wrong about this until, 2012, everybody ever, all over the world, and we've only got it right for the last 8 years. Or, we're off track now. And so it could be one of those two things, but you can't really have it both ways. And this is one of the things that's so interesting to me about Dante. It's like Dante, when you read Dante, you are immersed in a completely other worldview from our own, from the one you see on the news, and from the one that basically everybody in America now holds. And the weird problem with this is that, like, you've got, for example, I mean, if you just picture, like, I thought of this last night when I was looking at Twitter. Some, woman on Twitter whose bio said, PhD from Yale. And then she had her pronouns in the bio, and she had a rainbow flag or something. And so you have this set of, ideas, I guess we'll call them, right? This whole sort of moral viewpoint that she's bringing to the table, in which, abortion rights are good, same-sex marriage is progress, women's rights is important, and so on and so on. Now, all of those things, however you judge them, you have to acknowledge that they are not what Dante thought. Dante totally disagreed, and if he saw that list of things, he would have run for the hills. So you have those two different things. Now, all I'm saying is you got to choose which side you're on. And once you've chosen, the side that disagrees with you has to be written off as completely either evil or insane, right? And what's interesting is, like, the people at Yale are not yet writing off Dante as insane and evil. But I feel like they should have to. Like, you can't have Dante and this sort of woke ideology of, like, the post-2010 era. They do not fit together. They internally contradict each other. And, of course, this isn't just true of Dante. It's the whole Western tradition through 1960 or so. So if you want to retain, like, any, like, connection to, it's everything, right? But it's certainly the Christian stuff. I don't know. Shakespeare, even like the writer of Beowulf or Chaucer, Martin Luther, really any of it, all the way up through 1900, would have agreed more with Dante, certainly, than with this Yale PhD who's tweeting this stuff. I just find that fascinating. I feel like people don't yet realize the, like, cognitive dissonance that's happening here. The classics versus the woke view, you gotta choose. You can't have them both. Which is why I expect them to trash the entire Western canon in the next 5-10 years and start dating time again from the year 0, because, why should we be counting from the birth of Jesus? And rename the days of the week, because, why are we, they're named after Roman gods, which is, Eurocentric or something, and the planets. You have to do this. It makes sense given the direction of, like, the Yale PhD tweeter crowd. Okay. So that's pretty much, like, all I'm going to do here with Dante. There are some semi-related points, or maybe these are just, like, clickbait words, but I got to thinking yesterday, about natural law. I actually, like a lot of you, I'm sick of the news, but you can't totally avoid it. And I've been, basically locked indoors and avoiding public places so I wouldn't have to put a mask on my face and so on for the last 10 months or so. So it made me wonder, like, I wonder if, for example, these new vaccines, quote-unquote vaccines, really, because they work differently, right? They work on the mRNA mechanism somehow or whatever. And I don't understand this. I'm not claiming to be a scientist here. But I wonder if these are somehow, like, immoral from the Dantean natural law perspective, in the sense that they seem to really intervene in what are essentially laws of nature. The way viruses work, etc. You know what I mean? Like the immune system. That seems to be kind of a given to me. The two new ones, as I said, are being offered right now in America, work by this weird mRNA mechanism. And of course, if you read, like, the CDC website about it, they're going to be like, "Don't worry, like, this is fine. We've checked it. It's all good, And they make it sound all safe. And so, if you come up against an argument with somebody who wants to take these vaccines or who thinks they're not immoral or something, they're going to say, "Look, the CDC says it's fine," and so maybe you're. I don't know that you'll be able to win that argument. It is over my head. But it seems to involve reprogramming human body cells to make proteins that they otherwise wouldn't, which seems a little unnatural, doesn't it? And so part of what you're looking at there is, this is, I think I'm trying to beg the question, how far off track are we in terms of abiding by the natural law? And if you're not abiding by the natural law, then really what is the basis of your morality, right? I can think of one other possibility there, but it's not the one that the liberals are practicing. It's not the one that the progressives are on. The other possibility than natural law, I'm not sure the theological term for this, but it would be essentially like divine edict. So an example of this is thinking about why is there a restriction on eating pork in the Old Testament, for example? Is it because of natural law? Is there something about eating pork that's intrinsically not good for us, and that's why it's prohibited? Or is it just a whim of God, and it could be, we don't even, maybe there's no reason we can understand, maybe there's not even a reason, or maybe it's a reason that has to do with separation and so on. But the idea there would be God could just as easily have said, don't eat basil, the herb, or whatever. It's a willy-nilly random choice there, having nothing to do with the safety or the health, but it's just arbitrary. Okay, so when you think of things like sex being prohibited before marriage, it's is that in keeping with natural law? Is that bad for us and that's why it's prohibited? Or is it just God says so, don't ask any questions, you wouldn't be able to understand it anyway, right? So those seem to me to be the two theological bases for having a moral worldview. It's actually hard for me to conceive of what the progressive liberal metaphysic is here. What can you do and can't you do? I've seen these articles where they I saw one a few years ago where they spliced a pig's ear onto the back of a mouse or something, and it was growing there. That just seems that seems gross to me. But it's from the sort of secular progressive thing, it's well, why is that bad? And you just go does it hurt the animal? No. So okay, let's try it, And it's that seems to be, that to me, that's a real slippery place to be, and it could lead to sort of scary outcomes. Another example, relevant in the news, that I thought of yesterday while I was thinking about natural law. Now, I think money is an interesting example. Money originally, the old-fashioned money, even going back to gold coins or whatever, money seems to be tolerated by natural law, because alongside natural law theory, Aquinas wrote all this stuff about economic theory, and the scholastics created a whole economic theory about the use of money and so on. But it's interesting to think about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in this regard. I did see an article recently claiming that some Islamic scholars were concluding that Bitcoin is indeed halal. And you know why? They said it's legal, it's licit, it's legal, it's okay, that's halal, right? Because it doesn't inflate, which means it isn't a fraudulent currency. Isn't that an interesting observation? But it's an interesting example, isn't it? Are these mining algorithms, which sort of are the essence of Bitcoin as far as I can understand it, are these really a part of nature and nature's law? It seems like a bit of a stretch, in my opinion. But I'll probably buy some soon when it dips to 14,000. So speaking of fraud, by the way, that's the 8th circle of hell. It was always hard for my students to understand how fraud could be deemed worse than murder and suicide and so on. The answer seems to be that civilization itself is very fragile, and communities build interpersonal and institutional trust, and it doesn't take much fraud to unravel all of that trust. which is about where we are right now in America, isn't it? Where people have stopped trusting each other and the institutions, and that's because the elites sort of weren't good stewards of the public trust, it seems to me. There were, lies and conspiracies and, decisions that felt like they weren't in our interest and so on. And so eventually people have stopped trusting at least part of the government. I won't say too much else about Dante. I will say that one of my favorite cantos is one I'm not going to get to. It's the very last in Dante's Inferno. It's number 34. I said last time there were 33. That's because there's like an intro or a preface canto and then the 33 cantos. So the 34th one is where they kind of pull up on Satan himself. And the only thing I want to say about it that's really interesting is that Dante makes a big deal in the ninth circle of hell to say over and over again that, first of all, language sort of fails him. That is to say, you can't really, he struggles to describe what he sees in the ninth circle of hell. One of the things he sees in the ninth circle of hell is Nimrod, who is supposed to have been the builder of the Tower of Babel. And Nimrod is babbling, like he can't speak. And so you start to see the language starts to break down. And Dante often says things like, if only I had the words to describe this terrible layer of hell, I could do it. I can remember it all, but I don't have the words. And this suggests that, like, in the deepest, foulest place in hell, and again, I'm reading Dante as, like, at least in part, a psychologist. So this would be at your lowest, at your rock bottom, at your dark night of the soul. There's an ineffable place where, that is to say, it's so bad that we don't generally have language to describe this kind of stuff, if that makes sense. So, like, so as they approach, and the other thing that happens is, probably because language breaks down, perception becomes unreliable. So as they approach, Satan, who is described as like 10 stories tall, and he's got these huge bat wings, and he's weeping, by the way. He's weeping out of all of his eyes, which I find to be, does he have 6 eyes? He has 3 faces, it's like a dark trinity or something. And he's weeping. Isn't that fascinating? Like, why would Dante make Satan weeping at the bottom of hell, frozen in ice up to his waist? A lot of this is like unexpected, I suppose, and gnawing on, Judas and Cassius and Brutus forever. So why is he crying? I don't know. There's a suggestion in there maybe that Dante, is challenging us to think about essentially sympathy, right? Sympathy for the devil, I guess, would be the Rolling Stones version of it. But one of the, part of what's going on here in Dante's Inferno is you might feel bad for all these people in hell, but Dante, especially for the ones who committed sins of lust and gluttony and so on. But Dante, there's multiple times in this story where Virgil says to Dante, bro, let's keep going. These people got exactly what they deserved and do not deserve our sympathy. This is God's justice, and everything is just as it's supposed to be. So when you see, some suicide in the 7th circle of hell, I think his head is turned around backwards and he's weeping tears down his back or something. He's been turned into a thorn bush forever. Something like that. And it's that makes you feel bad, right? Because in the modern mind, it's like a suicide already had a really hard life. That's why they killed themselves, and now they're going to be punished forever. And you kind of want to play the little fiddle or the violin for them. But Dante implies don't do that. That's a mistake. Okay. So I'll stop on Dante. Wasn't that fun? I like Dante. I think you should read Dante. At least read. I don't know. For me, I still haven't got the hang of Purgatorio and Paradiso. I've read them both once, and I didn't like them as much because I didn't have the key. The key that helps you see that this is an analogy for something that really exists psychologically and in terms of human nature and so on. And because I didn't have that, I couldn't. It seemed like a bunch of random images to me. So I'll come back to them, but. Anyway, we're done with Dante. Next up, let's do some Stoicism. So we'll back up in history again and go back to the classical world. Probably, I said last time I was going to start with Epictetus, I mean, Stoicism seems really popular right now on the internet. There's like all over. There's Instagram accounts that are blowing up just quoting Stoics and stuff, and like a lot of these pop self-help books about how to make money. They seem to be in tune with the Stoics. You know, I might have a slightly different take on the Stoics than that. They're actually not my favorite, but I'm going to do probably 1 or 2 episodes on them. So I'll probably start with Marcus Aurelius and then mix in some Epictetus stuff. I think Epictetus is one of the best thinkers of all time. And if you're ever like feeling down and you don't have direction in your life, read his golden sayings. And if nothing else, you'll get like a 3-day boost of positive energy out of reading it. So, okay, I'll stop there for this episode. Merry Christmas. And I probably won't do another episode for a week or so because it's Christmas season and I need a little bit of a break. But I'll see you soon. Here's the outro music. Thanks for listening. Check out the stuff, you know, the Twitter account and all that. You can find that somewhere. Bye.